Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. John Merritt's boots hit the gravel driveway with the same steady rhythm that had carried him through 3 tours in Afghanistan. The familiar weight of his duffel bag pressed against his shoulder as he approached the front door of the 2-story colonial he'd called home for 8 years. The October air in Knoxville carried the scent of burning leaves and promised winter. He reached for his keys, then stopped. Something felt wrong. The house stood too quiet. No lights in the windows. No sounds of Riley practicing piano or Noah's laughter echoing from the backyard. John tried the door handle. Unlocked. Mary. His voice cut through the silence as he stepped inside. Riley? Noah. The living room looked exactly as he remembered. Same beige couch, same coffee table with water rings from countless movie nights. But emptiness hung in the air like smoke. John set down his bag and moved through the house with the careful precision that had kept him alive overseas. Kitchen empty. Family room empty. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Riley. He pushed open her bedroom door. The bed was made, but her stuffed animals were gone. So were the pictures from her nightstand. Noah's room told the same story. Toys missing. Clothes gone from the dresser. John's jaw tightened. He returned to the kitchen and saw what he'd missed in his initial sweep, a white envelope propped against the salt shaker on the table. His name written across the front in Mary's handwriting. He tore it open. John, I've moved on. I've met someone better. I want the house and the kids. Don't fight this. Mary. John read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it into his back pocket. He walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, twisting off the cap with practiced ease. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked. John drank his beer and stared at the empty chair where his son used to sit for breakfast, the one with crayon marks on the wooden arms. 12 years of marriage. 2 children. 3 deployments that had kept him away for months at a time, but he'd always come home. He'd always come back to them. John finished his beer and reached for his phone. The law office of Patterson and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a downtown building that smelled like coffee and disappointment. John sat across from Jim Patterson, a heavy-set man with kind eyes who'd handled legal matters for several guys from John's unit. She filed 2 weeks ago, Patterson said, sliding papers across his desk. Full custody, exclusive rights to the marital home. She's asking for child support and alimony. John scanned the documents. Mary's signature at the bottom looked different, more confident. Somehow. Bolder. What are my chances? Patterson leaned back in his chair. Honestly, not great. You've been deployed for 8 of the last 18 months. Her attorney is going to paint you as an absent father. I serve my country. I know that. You know that. But family court judges see a lot of military divorces. The narrative is always the same: soldier comes home changed. Family falls apart. Patterson's voice softened. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's reality. John set the papers down carefully. Who's her attorney? Delaney Cobb. She's good. Ruthless. Expensive. How expensive? More than a gym owner should be able to afford. John looked up sharply. Gym owner? The boyfriend. Trey Dobbs. Owns a place called Iron Paradise out on Kingston Pike. Patterson pulled out another file. I did some basic research. Business isn't doing well, from what I can tell. A lot of debt. John memorized the name. Trey Dobbs. He'd remember that. What's our next step? First hearing is Monday. She'll ask for temporary custody and exclusive use of the house. You'll get supervised visitation if we're lucky. Patterson met John's eyes. I have to ask, any domestic violence? Drinking? Anything she can use against you? No. PTSD. John's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. I see a counselor. Required after deployment. That could work for us or against us. Depends on how her attorney spins it. John stood. I want to see my kids. John, I want to see my kids. Patterson sighed. Let me make some calls. The coffee shop near the University of Tennessee campus buzzed with student conversations and the hiss of espresso machines. John sat in a corner booth, watching the door. Jules arrived 10 minutes late, her scrub still bearing traces of her shift at the hospital. Sorry. She slid into the seat across from him, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. At 31, Jules looked younger than her years, but her eyes held the steady calm of someone who'd seen people at their worst and helped them anyway. Triple trauma in the ER. Car accident. Everyone okay? 2 out of 3. Jules studied her brother's face. You look terrible. Thanks. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Tell me what happened. John explained about the empty house, the letter, the legal papers. Jules listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. That bitch, she said when he finished. Jules. No, I mean it. 12 years, John. 12 years you've been faithful to her, provided for her, protected this country so she could sleep safe in her bed. And this is how she repays you. John remembered the early days. Meeting Mary at a barbecue when he was 24 and she was 21. She'd been studying marketing at UT, bright and ambitious and beautiful in a way that made him forget his own name. He'd been stationed at Fort Campbell then, coming off his first deployment, still young enough to believe love could conquer anything. Their wedding had been perfect. Small ceremony in the mountains, Jules as maid of honor, his army buddies standing beside him in dress blues. Mary had wanted a big celebration, but they'd compromised. They'd compromised on a lot of things. Riley had been born 2 years later, during his second deployment. He'd gotten emergency leave and flown home to hold his daughter for the first time, this tiny miracle with Mary's green eyes and his stubborn chin. Noah had come along when Riley was 3, another perfect child who called him daddy and climbed on his shoulders and made him feel like the most important man in the world. But the deployments had gotten longer, the missions more dangerous, and Mary had grown resentful. You're never here, she'd said during their last fight, 3 months before this deployment. I'm raising these kids alone. I'm doing this for you. For them. You're doing this for yourself. Because it's easier than being here, dealing with real life. John had wanted to argue, but part of him knew she was right. Combat was simple. Clear objectives, defined enemies, measurable success. Family was messier. Earth to John. Jules waved her hand in front of his face. Where'd you go? Nowhere. He focused on his sister. You said something was off about this guy. Trey. I met him at the grocery store last month. He was with Mary and the kids. Jules's jaw tightened. Real charming. Designer clothes, expensive watch, kept talking about his business ventures. But there was something about him. The way he looked at other women while holding your son's hand. The way he talked to Mary like she was his property. What did the kids say? Nothing. They were quiet. Riley looked, scared isn't the right word. Cautious, maybe, like she was walking on eggshells. John filed that information away. His daughter had never been cautious. Riley was fire and sass and opinions about everything from homework to world politics. If she was being quiet, something was wrong. I need a favor, he said. Jules nodded. Anything. Keep your ears open. You work at the hospital, you hear things. People talk. You want me to spy on them. I want you to pay attention. There's a difference. Jules smiled, the first genuine expression she'd shown all afternoon. There's the brother I know, cold and calculating. I'm not cold. You are when someone threatens your family. Remember Tommy Henderson in high school? The one who cornered me at that party. John remembered. Tommy had ended up with a broken nose and a new understanding of consequences. This is different, he said. No, Jules replied. It's exactly the same. The next morning, John sat in Judge Harmon Ledger's courtroom, watching Mary testify about his failings as a husband and father. She wore a navy blue dress he'd never seen before, her blonde hair styled in a way that made her look both vulnerable and strong. He missed Riley's 9th birthday, Mary said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He missed Noah's first day of school, Christmas morning, Easter dinner, our anniversary. I can't even count how many times I've had to explain to my children why Daddy isn't here. Judge Ledger was a man in his 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes. Former Navy, according to Patterson's research. He listened to Mary's testimony with the same neutral expression he'd probably worn during 30 years of family court cases. Delaney Cobb stood beside Mary, a sharp-dressed woman with red hair and the predatory smile of someone who'd built a career on other people's misery. She guided Mary through a litany of John's absences, his emotional distance, his inability to connect with his children. Your Honor, Cobb said, My client isn't asking for anything unreasonable. She wants stability for her children. She wants a father who's present, not just when it's convenient for him. John watched from the defendant's table, his face a mask. Patterson had coached him to stay calm, show no emotion, let the process play out. But inside, rage built like pressure in a boiler. When Cobb finished, Judge Ledger turned to John. "Mr. Merritt, do you have anything to say?" John stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He walked to the center of the courtroom, aware that Mary was watching him, probably expecting him to break down or lash out or beg. Instead, he stood at attention and spoke in the clear, measured tone he'd used to brief superior officers. "I love my children. I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan to protect their freedom and their future. Every mission, every day overseas, I carried their pictures with me. I've never missed a deployment, never failed a mission, never let down my country or my unit." He looked directly at Judge Ledger. "I won't let down my children either." Judge Ledger nodded slightly. "Noted. Mrs. Cobb, what are you seeking for temporary orders?" "Full temporary custody for my client, exclusive use of the marital home, and supervised visitation for Mr. Merritt. 2 hours twice a week at the County Family Services building." Supervised visitation. Like he was a criminal, Judge Ledger considered for a long moment. "I'm granting temporary custody to Mrs. Langston, with liberal visitation for Mr. Merritt. For hours on Saturday, for hours on Sunday, no supervision required. As for the house, both parties will continue to have access until the final hearing." Patterson squeezed John's shoulder, a small victory. But John wasn't looking at his attorney. He was watching Trey Dobbs in the gallery, a man with slick back hair and a gym-toned physique wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Trey sat behind Mary, smug satisfaction written across his face. John committed every detail to memory. The expensive watch, the designer shoes, the way Trey's eyes moved around the courtroom like he owned it. After the hearing, John waited in the courthouse parking lot. He watched Mary and Trey leave together, saw how Trey's hand rested possessively on her lower back, how he opened the door of a black Mercedes sedan that looked fresh off the lot, a failing gym owner driving a $70,000 car. John started his own truck and followed at a distance. The Iron Paradise gym sat in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, its windows covered with advertisements for protein supplements and personal training packages. John parked across the street at a McDonald's and watched the building through the dinner rush. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse hearing. 3 weeks of supervised weekend visits where Riley barely spoke to him and Noah seemed afraid to hug him too long. 3 weeks of sleeping in a hotel room while Mary lived in their house with another man. But John had been busy. He'd driven by the gym every few days, noting the sparse parking lot and the small number of people coming and going. He'd researched Trey Dobbs online, finding social media posts full of expensive restaurants and weekend trips to Nashville. He'd even called the gym, pretending to inquire about membership rates, and learned that Iron Paradise was struggling to keep its doors open. None of it added up to the Mercedes or the designer clothes or Delaney Cobb's legal fees. John's phone buzzed. Text message from Luke Easton, his old squad leader who now worked for the Department of Defense, in some capacity he never talked about in detail. They'd served 2 tours together in Afghanistan, saved each other's lives more times than either man cared to count. "Can you meet tonight?" "Important." John stared at the message. Luke didn't use words like important lightly. In combat, Luke's understated warnings had kept their squad alive through ambushes and IED attacks. John typed back, "Where?" "Barley's. 9 p.m. Come alone." The last 2 words made John's skin prickle. Whatever Luke wanted to discuss wasn't casual. Barley's taproom was the kind of place soldiers went to drink beer and avoid talking about the war. Dark wood, cheap beer, and a bartender who knew when to listen and when to mind his own business. John arrived early and claimed a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. Luke walked in at exactly 9 o'clock, scanning the room with the automatic caution of someone who'd spent too many years in places where relaxing could get you killed. He was shorter than John, stockier, with prematurely gray hair and scars on his hands from an IED blast in Kandahar. He moved like a man carrying invisible weight. "You look like hell," Luke said, sliding into the opposite chair. "You look like a government employee." Luke smiled grimly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Close enough. He signaled the bartender for 2 beers, then leaned back and studied John's face. How long since you slept? I sleep. Real sleep. Not that combat nap bullshit where you wake up every hour checking the perimeter. John didn't answer because Luke already knew. They both carried the same scars, the same hypervigilance that made civilian life feel like walking through a minefield. How are you holding up? I've been better. Heard about the divorce. Heard about the boyfriend too. John leaned forward. What do you know about Trey Dobbs? Luke was quiet until the bartender delivered their drinks and moved away. Then he pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, and showed John a photograph. Trey Dobbs at what looked like a warehouse, talking to a man in military fatigues. The timestamp showed it was taken 6 months ago. Where is this? Can't say, but I can tell you that Trey Dobbs isn't clean. Luke put the phone away. I can't say much, but watch your back. What kind of not clean? Luke finished half his beer before answering. The kind that involves things that go boom and people who shouldn't have them. John felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long have you known? We've been watching him for 8 months. Building a case. But it's complicated because he's smart enough to use other people's names, other people's accounts. Luke met John's eyes. Other people's wives. The pieces clicked into place like a rifle being assembled in the dark. Mary's sudden wealth. Her confidence in court. Her willingness to fight for everything. She's involved. We think so. But proving it is another matter. Luke leaned closer. John, I'm telling you this as a friend. Stay away from this guy. Let us handle it. He's living in my house. With my children. I know. But if you do something stupid, you'll end up in prison and your kids will end up in foster care. John drank his beer and thought about Riley's cautious silence, Noah's frightened hugs. How long until you move? Could be weeks. Could be months. These things take time. I don't have time. Luke reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. He slid it across the table. Maybe this will help. But John the First was never here. We never had this conversation. John took the envelope but didn't open it. What is it? Information. Use it wisely. Saturday morning visitation at Jam's Nature Center. John had suggested the location because Riley loved hiking and Noah enjoyed looking for wildlife. But today, both children seemed more interested in their phones than the trails around them. The November air was crisp, leaves crunching under their feet as they walked the familiar path along the Tennessee River. How's school? John asked as they walked along the river path. Fine, Riley said without looking up from her screen. Mrs. Patterson said you got an A on your math test. Riley's step faltered slightly. How do you know that? I called the school. I'm still your father, Riley. I'm allowed to check on your grades. She didn't respond, but John caught the quick glance she shared with Noah. They'd been coached about something. He could see it in their careful posture, the way they avoided eye contact. What about that science project you were working on? The one about volcanoes. Turned it in. Did you get your grade back? Riley shrugged. B+. John remembered helping her with that project before his deployment. The two of them staying up late building a papier-mâché volcano. Riley's excitement when they added baking soda and vinegar to make it erupt. She'd been so proud, so eager to show him every detail. Now she acted like he was a stranger asking intrusive questions. John tried again. Noah, buddy, did you start soccer yet? Noah glanced at his sister before answering. A quick look that confirmed John's suspicions about coaching. Mom says we can't do sports right now. Too expensive. But Trey drove a Mercedes and Mary wore new clothes every time John saw her at school pickup. Last week, she'd been carrying a purse John recognized from a magazine advertisement, $800 for a piece of leather and metal. Nothing about their financial situation suggested money was tight. What about your friends from the team? Do you miss playing with them? Noah's face scrunched up, the expression he'd worn since he was 2 years old when trying not to cry. Jimmy asked why I quit. I didn't know what to tell him. John's chest tightened. Noah had been playing soccer since he was 4, had friends on that team, had been looking forward to this season all summer. Taking that away from him was cruel and unnecessary unless the goal was to isolate the children from activities John had supported. They found a picnic table overlooking the river. John unpacked sandwiches and drinks from a cooler. The The same lunch routine they'd enjoyed dozens of times before his deployment. But now his children ate in silence, checking their phones between bites. "Riley," John said finally, "look at me." She reluctantly raised her eyes. At 9 years old, she was already beautiful in the way that would someday break hearts, but her green eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. You haven't said 10 words to me in 2 hours. Riley shrugged. "Mom says you don't really care about us. She says you only come back because the court makes you." The words hit John like physical blows. He kept his voice steady. "What do you think?" "I think." Riley looked at Noah, then back at John. "I think you're different now." "Scary different." "Scary how?" "You watch everything. Like you're waiting for something bad to happen." John couldn't deny it. Combat had changed him, made him hyper-aware of threats and exits and the positioning of everyone around him. But he never thought his children noticed. "I watch because I care about keeping you safe." From what? John didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound paranoid or frighten them more than they already were. Instead, he reached across the table and took Riley's hand. "I know things are confusing right now. I know you're angry with me, and that's okay. But I need you to remember something." He looked at both children. "No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what happens, I will always love you. I will always fight for you. Always." Noah finally spoke up. "Mom says you're going to move far away." "I'm not going anywhere. She says after the court thing, we might not see you anymore." John's jaw tightened. Mary was poisoning his children against him, using their love as a weapon. It was psychological warfare, and she was winning. "That's not going to happen." Riley pulled her hand away. "How do you know?" "Because I promise." "You promised you wouldn't leave for the army again, too." "But you did." John had no answer for that. Because she was right. The second court hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in November. Frost covered the courthouse steps, and John's breath fogged in the cold air as he climbed toward the entrance. He'd been awake since 4 a.m., running through scenarios in his mind, preparing for Delaney Cobb's attack. John arrived early and sat in the gallery, watching Mary and Trey whisper together at the plaintiff's table. Mary wore a different expensive dress, navy blue, with silver buttons that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. Trey's suit looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about successful businessmen, complete with cufflinks that caught the courtroom's fluorescent lights. The contrast wasn't lost on John. 6 months ago, Mary had been clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores. Now she dressed like money was no object, while claiming in her court filings that finances were tight and John's child support payments were essential for the children's well-being. Judge Ledger entered, and the familiar ritual began. John watched the older man's face, looking for any hint of his thoughts. Former Navy, according to Patterson's research, a man who understood duty and sacrifice. But family court judges saw a lot of broken soldiers, a lot of men who came home changed and couldn't adapt to civilian life. Delaney Cobb called Mary to the witness stand first, guiding her through a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Mary talked about John's emotional distance, his inability to connect with his children, his violent tendencies that frightened her and the kids. "Has he ever threatened you?" Cobb asked. "Not directly, but there's an anger in him now, a coldness. The children are afraid of him." John's hands clenched in his lap. Every word was calculated to paint him as a dangerous stranger in his own family. "And what about Mr. Dobbs? How do the children respond to him?" Mary's face softened. "Trey is wonderful with them. Patient, kind, present. He's been more of a father to them in 3 months than John has been in 3 years. Cobb nodded sympathetically. "Your Honor, my client isn't asking for anything unreasonable. She's asking for stability, safety, a chance for her children to have a normal life with a man who puts family first." John watched Judge Ledger's face, looking for any sign of reaction. The older man took notes, but gave nothing away. When it was Patterson's turn, he called John to testify. John walked to the witness stand with military bearing, aware that every person in the courtroom was evaluating him, judging him, deciding his worth as a father. Patterson asked about his service record, his decorations, his commitment to his family. John answered each question clearly and honestly, but he could feel the hostility in the room like heat from a fire. Then Cobb stood for cross-examination. Mr. Merritt, how many of your daughter's birthday parties have you attended? 6 out of 9. How many of your son's soccer games? Deployment schedules made it difficult to. How many, Mr. Merritt? 3. Cobb walked closer to the witness stand. Your Honor, this man has missed birthdays, school events, holidays, parent-teacher conferences. He's deployed for months at a time, leaving his wife to raise their children alone. When he is home, he's emotionally unavailable, dealing with what I can only assume are the psychological effects of combat. She turned back to John. Are you currently receiving treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder? Patterson started to object, but John answered before he could speak. I see a counselor. It's standard procedure after deployment. Because you have PTSD. Because the Army requires it. That's not what I asked, Mr. Merritt. Do you have PTSD? John looked at Mary, saw her watching him with something that might have been satisfaction. He thought about the manila envelope Luke had given him, still unopened in his hotel room. He thought about Trey Dobbs driving a car worth more than most people's houses while claiming his business was failing. Yes, he said quietly. I have PTSD. Cobb smiled like a shark tasting blood. And do you believe a man suffering from combat-related psychological trauma should have unsupervised access to young children? I would never hurt my children. But you've been trained to hurt people, haven't you? To kill people. Patterson finally got his objection sustained, but the damage was done. John could see it in Judge Ledger's eyes, in the way Mary held herself straighter, in Trey's satisfied smirk. When court recessed, John found himself alone in the hallway. Patterson was on his phone, probably calling other clients to explain why their cases were running late. Mary and Trey had disappeared with Cobb, probably celebrating their victory. John walked outside into the cold November air and called Luke. I need to see what was in that envelope. John, tonight. My hotel room. Bring whatever else you have. This isn't a game. No, John said, watching his breath fog in the cold air. It's war. Luke arrived at John's hotel room, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man about to break federal law. John had spread the contents of the manila envelope across the bed photographs, bank records, shipping manifests, and surveillance reports that painted a picture of Trey Dobbs as something much more dangerous than a failing gym owner. This is everything, John asked. Everything I can share without ending my career. Luke sat in the room's single chair. Trey Dobbs has been running weapons through his gym for 18 months. Small stuff at first, pistols, ammunition, the kind of things that don't draw attention. But lately he's gotten ambitious. John studied a photograph of Trey loading crates into a delivery truck. What kind of ambitious? The kind that involves military-grade hardware making its way to people who definitely shouldn't have it. Luke opened his briefcase and pulled out more documents. We think he's part of a larger network. Domestic terrorism, anti-government groups, the works. And Mary, her bank accounts show deposits that don't match any legitimate income source. Wire transfers from shell companies, cash deposits that stay just under federal reporting requirements. She's either the smartest money launderer in Tennessee, or she's getting coached by someone who knows the system. John picked up a bank statement with Mary's name at the top. Deposits of $9,800 every 2 weeks for the past 6 months. Just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic federal reporting. She knows what she's doing. Looks that way. John set down the bank statement and reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Marlon Rourke, the therapist the Army had assigned him. What are you doing? Luke asked. Making an appointment. Dr. Rourke's office occupied the second floor of a medical building near the VA hospital. The walls were decorated with landscapes and motivational posters, the kind of aggressively positive environment designed to make soldiers feel safe talking about things they'd rather forget. John had been seeing Rourke for 6 months, working through the anger and hypervigilance that followed him home from Afghanistan. The doctor was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and endless patience for John's reluctance to open up. You look different today, Rourke said as John settled into the familiar leather chair. More focused. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. If someone was using my children as shields while they committed crimes, what would you advise me to do? Rourke leaned forward slightly. That's a very specific hypothetical. It's not hypothetical. John explained about the divorce, about Trey, about the federal investigation and Mary's apparent involvement. Rourke listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. "You're describing a complex situation," Rourke said when John finished. "You feel like your children are in danger, but you're constrained by legal and social systems that don't recognize the threat." "Something like that. What do you want to do about it?" John was quiet for a long moment. "What I was trained to do. Identify the target. Plan the mission. Execute with precision." "And what would that look like in this context?" "I don't know yet." Rourke set down his pen. "John, you're not fighting your ex-wife. You're not even fighting her boyfriend. You're protecting your children from a storm they don't see coming." The words crystallized something in John's mind. This wasn't about revenge or winning or proving Mary wrong. This was about Riley and Noah, about keeping them safe from people who would use them as human shields while trafficking weapons to terrorists. "I need to be smart about this." "Yes, you do. And you need to remember that the skills that kept you alive in combat can be adapted for different kinds of battles." That night, John sat in his hotel room with Luke's files spread across the bed like pieces of a tactical puzzle. He cross-referenced names, dates, locations, building a timeline of Trey's criminal activities and Mary's involvement. He identified patterns, weaknesses, opportunities that he thought about Judge Ledger, the former Navy man who understood duty and sacrifice. He thought about Delaney Cobb's arrogance, her assumption that John was just another broken veteran. He thought about Mary's confidence in court, her belief that she'd already won. John opened his laptop and began typing, methodical and emotionless as planning a mission. The hotel room's desk lamp cast harsh light across the keyboard as he cross-referenced names, dates, and locations from Luke's files. He had 3 weeks until the final custody hearing. 3 weeks to build a case that would not only win him his children, but ensure their safety. The federal database access Luke had provided opened doors John had never seen before. Financial records, surveillance reports, communication intercepts, a digital trail that painted Trey Dobbs as far worse than a failing gym owner with expensive tastes. John created a timeline, starting with Trey's first suspicious bank deposits 18 months ago and tracking the progression of his criminal enterprise. Small amounts at first, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. But the deposits had grown larger and more frequent, always timed to correspond with what looked like legitimate business transactions, but were actually cover for something much darker. He cross-referenced the dates with shipping records Luke had included in the files. Packages arriving at the Iron Paradise gym from addresses in states with loose gun laws. Packages being redistributed to addresses that matched known anti-government militia groups, the BY3AM. John had mapped out Trey's entire operation. The gym was a front, used to launder money and distribute weapons to domestic terrorists. Mary wasn't just a convenient girlfriend, she was an active participant, using her banking knowledge from her marketing degree to structure transactions that avoided federal reporting requirements. John worked through the night, building connections between Trey's associates and known criminal organizations, identifying patterns that would make federal prosecutors salivate. By dawn, he had a strategy that went beyond winning custody. He had a plan to dismantle an entire criminal network. That IT wasn't revenge. It was justice. The final custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in December. Snow had fallen the night before, coating Knoxville in a thin layer of white that made the courthouse steps treacherous. John arrived at the building 45 minutes early, carrying a leather briefcase that contained everything he'd need to end this war once and for all. The briefcase had belonged to his father, a World War II veteran who'd carried it to work every day for 30 years of the TVA. John had inherited it along with his father's sense of duty and his unwillingness to back down from a fight when his family was threatened that he'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, working with Luke to coordinate federal agencies, timing everything down to the minute. The briefcase contained a single sealed document that would change everything, but first he had to endure Mary's final performance. Security was tighter than usual at the courthouse. John noticed additional guards, men with earpieces who weren't part of the regular staff. Federal marshals, probably, already in position for what was about to unfold. Judge Ledger's courtroom was fuller than usual. Word had gotten out somehow that this wasn't just another custody dispute. Mary sat at the plaintiff's table with Delaney Cobb, wearing a burgundy dress that probably cost more than John's monthly hotel bill. Her hair was styled in loose waves, her makeup perfect, every detail calculated to project the image of a devoted mother protecting her children from an unstable ex-husband. Trey sat in the gallery, confident and smug, checking his expensive watch like he had somewhere important to be after watching John's life get destroyed. He wore a charcoal suit with a red tie, looking like a successful businessman rather than a criminal who trafficked weapons to domestic terrorists. What Trey didn't know was that federal agents were already in position outside the courthouse, parked in unmarked vehicles with communication equipment and arrest warrants. What Mary didn't know was that her bank accounts had been under surveillance for weeks, every transaction monitored and recorded. What Delaney Cobb didn't know was that her client was about to become the subject of a federal indictment that would make headlines across Tennessee. John had spent the last 3 weeks coordinating with Luke and the federal task force, providing intelligence and helping them build an airtight case. Every meeting with Trey, every suspicious bank deposit, every weapon shipment, it was all documented, recorded, and ready to be presented to a federal grand jury. The irony wasn't lost on John. Mary had thought she was so clever, using her marketing degree to structure financial transactions that avoided federal reporting requirements. But her cleverness had created a paper trail that federal prosecutors could follow like breadcrumbs back to its source. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Ledger entered the courtroom. Cobb stood for her opening statement, launching into a passionate speech about John's unfitness as a father. She painted him as a dangerous veteran whose PTSD made him a threat to his own children, a man so emotionally damaged that he couldn't provide the stability Riley and Noah deserved. "Your Honor," Cobb said, "my client has moved on with her life. She's found a partner who puts family first, who's present for every school play and soccer game, who loves these children as if they were his own. Mr. Dobbs has already proven himself to be more of a father than Mr. Merritt ever was." John watched Mary nod along with her attorney's words. She looked confident, satisfied, like a woman who'd already won. She had no idea that federal agents were reading text messages between her and Trey, documenting wire transfers and weapon shipments and enough evidence to send them both to prison for 20 years. Cobb called Mary to testify, and once again Mary performed flawlessly. She talked about John's anger, his isolation, his inability to connect with his children. She described Trey as patient and loving, a man who'd stepped up when John had failed. "He takes Riley to her piano lessons," Mary said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "He helps Noah with his homework. He's everything I wanted John to be, but never was." Judge Ledger listened impassively, occasionally taking notes. When Cobb finished her examination, she yielded to Patterson for cross-examination. Patterson asked a few routine questions, nothing aggressive, nothing that would suggest John had any new evidence or strategy. He was playing his role perfectly, making Mary and her team believe they'd already won. Then Patterson called John to testify. John walked to the witness stand with the same calm precision he'd used approaching enemy positions in Afghanistan. He was sworn in and took his seat, aware that every person in the courtroom was watching him, judging him, deciding his fate. Patterson asked about his relationship with his children, his love for them, his commitment to their safety and well-being. John answered clearly and honestly, but he could feel the hostility in the room. Everyone had already made up their minds about him. When Patterson finished, Cobb stood for what she clearly expected to be the killing blow. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "you've heard my client's testimony about your emotional distance, your inability to be present for your children. Do you dispute any of that?" "No," John said quietly. "I was deployed. I missed things. And you've heard her testimony about Mr. Dobbs, about what a positive influence he's been on Riley and Noah. Do you have any evidence to contradict that?" John looked directly at Trey, who was leaning back in his seat with the satisfied expression of a man who'd won. "I have concerns about Mr. Dobbs's influence on my children." "What kind of concerns?" "I'm concerned that he's using my family to launder money from illegal weapons sales." The courtroom erupted. Cobb spun around to stare at John in shock. Mary's face went white. Trey started to stand, then seemed to think better of it. "Your Honor," Cobb sputtered. This is completely inappropriate. Judge Ledger banged his gavel. Order. Mr. Merritt, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to support it? John reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. Yes, Your Honor. I do. He walked to the bench and handed Judge Ledger the envelope. The older man opened it, and John watched his eyes widen as he scanned the first page. Bailiff, Judge Ledger said quietly. No one leaves this courtroom. The bailiff moved to the doors, positioning himself to block any exit. Judge Ledger continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. Your Honor, Cobb tried again, whatever Mr. Merritt thinks he's discovered. Mrs. Cobb, Judge Ledger said without looking up from the documents, I suggest you remain quiet. John returned to the witness stand and waited. He could see Mary whispering frantically to her attorney, could see Trey checking his phone, probably trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Judge Ledger finished reading and looked up. Mr. Merritt, where did you obtain this information? From federal law enforcement, Your Honor. I believe there are agents waiting outside who can verify its authenticity. Judge Ledger nodded to the bailiff, who opened the courtroom doors. Luke Easton walked in, wearing a suit and federal badge, followed by two other agents John didn't recognize. Agent Easton, Judge Ledger said, I assume you're here about Mr. Dobbs? Yes, Your Honor. We have warrants for the arrest of Trey Dobbs and Mary Langston on federal charges of weapons trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. Trey finally understood what was happening. He bolted from his seat, trying to push past the other spectators toward the rear exit. One of the federal agents caught him before he made it 3 steps, driving him to the floor with the kind of takedown John had seen in combat. Mary stood frozen at the plaintiff's table, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. I don't understand, she kept saying. I don't understand. Cobb was frantically gathering her papers, probably trying to figure out how to distance herself from clients who were about to be charged with federal crimes. Luke approached the witness stand. Mr. Merritt, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your information was invaluable. John nodded. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Only a cold professionalism that came from completing a mission. Judge Ledger banged his gavel again. This court is in recess pending resolution of these federal charges. Mr. Merritt, I'm granting you temporary full custody of your children, effective immediately. Mary's arraignment took place the following Monday. John sat in the gallery, watching as she stood before a federal judge in an orange jumpsuit, her hands shackled, her expensive clothes replaced by county jail attire. The prosecutor read the charges: conspiracy to traffic illegal weapons, money laundering, tax evasion, and endangering the welfare of minors. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, recorded phone calls, surveillance photographs, and testimony from federal agents who'd been building the case for months that Mary's court-appointed attorney Delaney Cobb had withdrawn from the case as soon as the federal charges were announced, entered a plea of not guilty. But everyone in the courtroom knew it was a formality. The evidence was too strong, the case too solid that Trey's arraignment had been the previous Friday. He'd been denied bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk and a danger to the community. His smuggling operation had been more extensive than anyone had realized, involving military-grade weapons and connections to domestic terrorist organizations. After the arraignment, John met with federal prosecutor Amanda Wells in her downtown office. The building was one of those modern glass towers that sprouted from Knoxville's downtown in the past decade, a monument to the city's growth and federal presence in Tennessee. Wells's office was on the 15th floor with windows that looked out over the Tennessee River and the mountains beyond. Wells was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd built her career prosecuting organized crime and terrorism cases. She had the lean build of a runner and the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent years dissecting criminal enterprises and finding their weak points. Your ex-wife is looking at 20 years minimum, Wells said, sliding a file across her desk. The folder was thick, stuffed with evidence that would make any defense attorney consider a career change. She's already approached us about a plea deal. John opened the file and saw photographs of Mary meeting with known associates of Trey's criminal network. Bank records showing her role in structuring financial transactions, and recorded phone conversations where she discussed weapon shipments with casual familiarity. "What kind of deal?" John asked. "Full cooperation. Testimony against Dobbs and his associates. Names, dates, locations, everything she knows about the operation." Wells leaned back in her chair. "In exchange, we'd recommend 15 years with possibility of parole in 10, and custody of my children." She's agreed to relinquish all parental rights as part of the plea agreement. No visitation, no contact, no claims to child support or property. She knows she's going to prison for a long time, Mr. Merritt. She wants to make sure her children aren't left in limbo. John felt something settle in his chest, a knot of tension he'd carried for months finally loosening. Mary had chosen her path, and now she was facing the consequences. But at least she was trying to do one right thing for Riley and Noah. What about the house? Seized as part of the investigation. But, Wells smiled slightly. The Department of Defense has a program for military families affected by domestic terrorism cases. They've authorized a replacement home near Fort Campbell. Same value, better neighborhood. John thought about starting over, about Riley and Noah having to change schools and leave their friends. But then he thought about them living in a house where Trey Dobbs had conducted a legal business, where federal agents had found evidence of weapons trafficking in the garage. "We'll take it." That afternoon, John picked up his children from Jules's house, where they'd been staying since their mother's arrest. Riley and Noah sat quietly in the back seat of his truck as he drove them to their old house to collect their belongings. "Are we in trouble?" Noah asked as John unlocked the front door. "No, buddy. You're not in trouble. What about Mom?" John knelt down to Noah's eye level. "Mom made some bad choices. She's going to have to face the consequences of those choices. Will we see her again?" John looked at Riley, who was listening intently despite pretending to check her phone. "I don't know. Maybe someday, when you're older. But for now, it's just going to be us." Riley finally looked up. "Are you going to leave again? For the Army?" "No, I'm getting out. My job now is taking care of you and your brother. Promise." John remembered all the promises he'd made and broken, all the times he'd chosen duty over family. "I promise." 6 months later, John sat on the front porch of their new house near Fort Campbell, watching Riley and Noah play in the yard. The house was bigger than their old one, with 4 bedrooms and a basement where the kids could hang out with their friends. The neighborhood was quiet and safe, full of military families who understood the challenges of service and sacrifice. The spring air carried the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. John had planted a garden along the back fence: tomatoes, peppers, herbs that reminded him of his grandmother's garden when he was a boy. Riley had helped him choose the seeds, and Noah had insisted on planting sunflowers that were already growing taller than his head. Jules lived 20 minutes away in a townhouse she'd bought after getting promoted to charge nurse in the ER. She visited every Sunday for dinner, bringing groceries and staying to help with homework and bedtime stories. The kids adored their aunt, and she'd become their anchor in the months following Mary's arrest and imprisonment. Riley had started piano lessons again and was making friends at her new school. Her teacher said she had natural talent and the discipline to develop it into something special. Noah had joined a soccer team and scored 2 goals in his first game, running around the field afterward with the pure joy that only 6-year-old boys could manage. They still asked about Mary sometimes, but less frequently as time passed, and their new life became their real life. John had explained that their mother was in prison, that she'd made choices that hurt a lot of people, and that she'd have to serve her sentence before she could see them again. He'd been honest about the situation while protecting them from the darker details of her crimes. The PTSD was better too, managed through continued therapy with Dr. Rourke and the simple peace that came from knowing his children were safe. John still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, checking the locks and windows, but the hypervigilance that had defined his early months home was fading into something more manageable that a postal truck pulled into the driveway, and John signed for a certified letter from the federal prosecutor's office. Mary's plea deal had been finalized. 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole in 10. Trey had been sentenced to 25 years with no possibility of parole. John opened the letter and read the details, then folded it carefully and walked to the backyard. Riley and Noah were building a fort out of cardboard boxes, their laughter carrying across the evening air. He lit the outdoor fire pit and watched the flames catch. Then he reached into his wallet and pulled out the letter Mary had left on their kitchen table 8 months ago, the one that had started this whole war. "I've met someone better." John dropped the letter into the fire and watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening until Mary's words disappeared into smoke and ash. When it was gone completely, he turned away from the fire and walked toward his children, toward the life they were building together. Riley looked up as he approached. "Dad, can you help us with the roof?" "Sure," John said, kneeling down beside the cardboard fort. "What do you need?"